right, welcome everybody. I'm just delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Richard A. Jarrell Fund. The talk is in Science, Technology, and Society. This is intended as a yearly event showcasing the research of various faculty in our program of Science, Technology, and Society. Richard Jarrell, I'm going to talk about him a little bit more, but the intention, above all, is for undergraduates. And if you're not an undergraduate, that's fine. But the Richard A. Jarrell Fund was set up, and Martha Jarrell, Rich's widow, is here and is the administrator of this fund, wanted something that would really encourage participation, especially of undergraduates, who are often the sort of forgotten element here at York. And it's tremendously exciting to be a part of this. And it's also kind of a relaunch of the Science, Technology, and Society program. Richard was a very, very productive historian of astronomy, famous as probably maybe he was a well-respected historian of astronomy, as much as historians of science can be. And he's so productive that, in fact, a new book based on his work is actually coming out, or just came out. I don't remember the title. Do you remember the Canadian radio astronomy? So he's still producing this material. But something that really marked him, and again, it was his passion for engagement. And that's why this topic is so important today, obviously, with developments we see all around us, particularly in the South, but also here as well in Canada. And so this topic of the rise of a tech oligarchy is a really important one that our department is really well suited to cover. Thinking about the relationship of science, technology, and society. And the speaker here today is particularly well suited. I'm delighted to be able to really present him as a world-leading expert in this subject. One of York's own, and really something to be proud of and to champion. And so how to summarize Kean's achievements. His CV is over 16,000 words long. He's authored 6 books, or co-authored 6 books, 4 edited volumes, 8 special issues, journal issues, 1 in progress, 27 book chapters, and 52 peer-reviewed articles. That was as of last term, so it's probably up to 53 or 54. He's co-editor of the journal Sciences Culture. He's on the editorial board of 2 leading STS journals. But I like to think that this work, these 16,000 words, can be distilled into 4 words. How is data valued? And in asking this question, Professor Birch's achievement has been to connect STS with political economy. And this has led to new ways to think about how large firms shape research and innovation. Birch is perhaps best known for developing the concept of assetization and rentiership to think about monetization of data and intellectual property. Here at York, he's helped to co-found the new organized research unit, the Institute for Technoscience and Society. He supervised 3 postdoctoral fellows, 5 PhD students, and 11 MA students. Currently, he supervises 2 postdoctoral fellows, 7 PhD students, and 1 MA student. Meanwhile, he works with think tanks such as the Center for International Governance Innovation, and with professional associations such as Professional Engineers Ontario. And while he works at the high end of science policy, submitting briefs to both the Federal Competition Bureau and Ontario Associate Ministry for Digital Government, he also has the time, I love this, to advise the makers of a board game called Hegemony. And finally, his research has meant he's increasingly in demand as a public commentator. And I'm not going to list any, it's just, there's too much to list at this point. But I want, again, the Richard A. Jarrell Fund and the Department of Science, Technology, and Society are delighted to welcome for the inaugural talk Professor Kean Birch, Ontario Research Chair in Science Policy, giving the inaugural talk in Science, Technology, and Society.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was a wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So thank you for being here today, and thank you to those who've watched this in the future. I kind of, as an academic, we can sometimes come across as rather narrow and insular in our, the things we focus on. So I thought I'd start the lecture with my kind of, so what, the reason that I do this research and why STS actually matters for the world. So does anyone know who this is? Oh, sorry, I should have hidden the name. Everyone knows who this is now. So this is my so what rationale. I've been thinking a lot about tech oligarchy and oligarchy in general, so rule by the rich, and I'll come back to that towards the end. And it got me thinking about people like this, Adam Neumann. So Adam Neumann, if you don't know who he is, he's the ex-CEO of WeWork. WeWork is a rather famous or infamous so-called unicorn company that was established by Neumann. He's a co-founder of WeWork back in, I can't remember, he established it 2008, something like that. But WeWork went bankrupt in 2023, 4 years after it tried to launch itself on the public markets through an initial public offering. And at the time, it was valued that it tried to launch itself into the public market. It was valued at about $47 billion, and that was in 2019. This IPO was a failure, and it's a failure for specific reasons, but it led to the ousting of Adam Neumann as the CEO, which was sweetened by a package worth about $1.7 billion that he got paid off by the venture fund SoftBank. So it's I think this is a nice example of kind of failing upwards. Now, what got me thinking about Neumann was that he reappeared in 2023 after the end of his non-compete period, and he started promoting a new venture, and he called it Flow. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that he can still attract venture capitalists like Mark Andreessen, who's the author of a fun manifesto called the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. But this venture capitalist gave Neumann $350 million to start this Flow venture. Now, maybe Flow is different than WeWork. Maybe it will be a success. But what is it? And I think what's interesting to turn to Adam's own words, or Neumann's own words, to try and get a sense of this. So in an interview, he first starts talking about WeWork, and he goes, and again, I think very few people disrupt categories, and very few companies reinvent categories. Office space is the second largest category in the world, and that's how WeWork. He goes on to talk about Flow. Flow is building I heard the mission you said before. I'm not sure that is actually our mission, but sounded interesting. But Flow is building a consumer-facing residential, that's my daughter's pickup time, I say. Building a consumer-facing residential brand. And we're doing it through integrating technology, community, and the world-class operating team that puts the residents first. Now, this is clear. I have no idea what Flow is about at this point. He goes on to say, there's a lot of basic things in residential real estate that are in effect. So we have to follow all the rules that exist. It's actually a very advanced category when it comes to that, but a very early category when it comes to actually innovation or technology or giving in your experience. Whatever they are, we take them extremely seriously, but they change between state and state, and it depends if you're owning the building, building the building, operating the building, and then Flow starts here. Sorry, I have no idea what he's talking about. Absolutely no idea what he's talking about. My conclusion from this, and sort of the starting point, as I said, it's my so what of the, thinking about tech oligarchy, is these are not serious people, right? These are people who making things up as they go along, right? Yet they are taken very seriously because they are people with money, and money equals power. And this is why understanding the political economy of science, technology, innovation matters so much. It's in order for us to understand, what's going on and be able to change and determine our futures. So we have to understand how economies and societies are being shaped by a bunch of tech oligarchs. Yeah, I have a slightly ruder term in my speech here, but I won't use it. Who have no clue about anything outside of their limited life experiences and worldviews, and we're struggling. So we are struggling against the presumption that only some people, the tech oligarchs, have the capacity to act, to innovate, to decide what technologies we can and should have as societies. And so I hope my lecture today contributes to a critique of that kind of thinking. This just gives you a sense of what I'm going to talk about. It's a series of research interests and topics that I've been dealing with over the last, I don't know how many years now, but let's say 10 years or so. And I'm hoping that I can bring it together in what I tell you today. I was going to start with the kind of science technology studies. I'm assuming that not everyone knows what it is. And so I'll give you a rundown of what I think it is. This is what I think it is, but obviously there'll be other people that disagree with me. There are several premises to start with. Knowledge, including science and technology, are collectively produced, constituted, and legitimated. So the idea of lone geniuses just doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. To understand science and technology requires looking at social, political, and economic context, because these shape science and technological developments, diffusion, impacts, and such like. Now in SKS, we understand science and technology as technoscience in order to kind of capture this relationship, this entanglement between science, technology, and society. Technoscience is socially, culturally, and economically configured, meaning that science and technology are not neutral or free from bias or necessarily liberating, democratizing, that sort of thing. Technoscience is socially and culturally powerful. We have institutions that, teach science, like universities. We have startups and so on, and we also have authority derived from technoscience, like degrees and status and things like that. Now there are contests between forms of technoscience, between kind of institutionalized forms versus lay forms or citizen science, open proprietary things like that. And we need to think about, best to then think about technoscience and societies being co-constructed, shaping each other, that sort of thing. Now, where I come in particular is that there is a political economy to technoscience in relates to the decisions about the allocation of resources, societal resources, to research and innovation, as well as the justification for these decisions and their impacts. This generally gets called something like science policy, science innovation policy. Crucially, to finish off, then capitalism plays a major role in shaping the technoscience we end up with. Which brings me to big tech. Now, I understand big tech as being constituted by and within a form of capitalism that I like to think of as technoscientific capitalism, which is defined by an increasing independence between technoscientific innovation and finance. So technoscience is constituted increasingly by specific forms of financing. We can think of corporate R&D and financial logic, so venture capital, return on investment calculations, that sort of thing. But capitalism is also constituted by specific forms of technoscience, so disruptive innovation and technoscientific logics, network effects, things like that. The anthropologist Kaushik Sundararajan, to paraphrase him, argues that capitalism is pursued by technoscientific means. Now, what I think is also new to technoscientific capitalism, to build on some of these ideas, is that there's underlying this two-way interaction relationship between technoscience and capitalism is a new kind of dynamic in which technoscientific and market actors are increasingly reflexive in their actions and decisions. So they're deliberately looking to jumpstart new kinds of techno-economic revolutions and paradigms in order to capture kind of economic returns from it. Now, big tech is a manifestation of these trends. And I'll start with some definitions and some illustrations of why we call it big tech and its power and so on. How long do you want me to talk for, by the way?
No. I was thinking the 50 minutes, the usual 50.
Okay, no question. I'll try and keep my own time, make sure that I'm not boring everyone.
I'll let you.
Okay, thanks. So starting with definitions, right? Big tech. There's a ton of work out there about big tech that's come out in the last few years. Academic work, Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism book, Nick Sterntek, Platform Capitalism, Cedric Durand talking about techno-feudalism. And there's a ton of popular work as well. So books like Don't Be Evil by the FT columnist Rana Furaha, a new one, Tech Coup by Maricha Shaka. And my own one, well, actually, there's a really new one called Careless People by someone called Sarah Wynne Williams, which I've been reading recently, which is all about meta It's a biography of the time and matter. It's fascinating. And I wrote a book called Data Envelopes, just to self-promote. So there's lots of different ways that people talk about big tech, different kinds of acronyms people use, like GAFAM, FANG, the Big Four. These all reflect a few companies, basically. The companies, you can see the kind of acronyms at the bottom of the slides here: Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. This is the top, the rest of the kind of top 200 firms in the US stock market. You can see that line, that black line there. Now, this graph just shows you the kind of expansion of the big tech over the last, I guess this is nearly 30 years. So I use the term big tech because I think it's easier than having to change your acronym every time one of the companies changes its name. But people are also now starting to use Magnificent Seven as another term to adding Tesla and Nvidia to this list of 5 companies. It's very US focused, focusing on US corporations. And these corporations represent, these 5 big tech corporations now, well, in this slide, they represent about 25% of the S&P 200. So 25% of the stock market, well, the largest companies in the stock market. But this was in 2021. So in December 2024, most of them had trillion-dollar valuations. So Apple was worth $3.8 trillion, Nvidia nearly $3.4 trillion, Microsoft $3.2 trillion, and so on and so forth. All 7 of them, the Magnificent Seven together, represented nearly $18 trillion, or nearly 40% of the S&P 500. That was in December 2024. So a huge proportion of the stock market. Although this is not a great comparison, if you look at, we could, compare this to the Canadian GDP, which is about $2.24 trillion last year. So the US stock market off the charts, basically. And these companies are the kind of major booming companies of the last 2 years. This rise has not been without backlash. And this really starts in 2016, post Brexit, post Trump's first election. And it's continued since then with various kinds of investigations into online advertising, digital market power, online harms, privacy concerns, state and police, and so on. There are continuing government actions in the US with lawsuits against companies like Google. There are European Union implementing new kinds of regulations like the Digital Markets Act. Canada had the Online News Act, things like that have all been part of this kind of backlash. Now, what I want to unpack is what makes big tech distinct. And we can think, obviously, scale, size is one of them. This is the obvious one. But it's not just market capitalization. It's not just this size. It's also their market power. So if we draw on the work that a US congressional investigation did in 2019-20, that came out, that was published in 2020, I think it's called something like Competition in Digital Markets Investigation, something like that. They argued that Google controls about 81% of the general search on desktops, 94% on mobile. Amazon is about 40% e-commerce. Facebook has 4 of the top 5 social networks, social media products. Apple, Android represent a majority of smartphones. Google and Apple's app stores represent, because the control of the smartphones represented, they dominate the app stores and charge fees for every app and in-app purchases and things. Chrome and Safari, 80% web browsers. Online advertising is at 60% global market share by Google and Facebook. And then Amazon, Google, Microsoft are about 2/3 of cloud computing. So huge companies, huge control over various kinds of markets, infrastructures, and so on. Now, scale often gets reduced to network effects. I'll come back to what these are later on, but it's basically the idea that the more users you have, the more attractive that network becomes. And this is true, but I think there's something else going on here. A second part of what makes big tech distinct is actually the kind of modular technical architecture that they develop, create, and so on. So the platforms and ecosystems that they have are very modular in the eventual kind of arrangements that they have. So scale is married to this modularity. They create a series of what I think of as boundary assets or resources that attract users, attract developers, attract advertisers, other businesses into their ecosystems. And this This digital infrastructure enables other companies or other businesses, other advertisers or developers to scale quite quickly and cheaply. So it's very attractive. But control over it still rests with the big tech companies. So they still control the rules of the game, as it were. And so that's why I define these as enclaves. This is the way I kind of define. So big tech ubiquity is a result of the scale and modularity, their scale and their modularity. What Anne Hellman calls platformization, which is the kind of way that they're both open and pull in others into their ecosystem. Sorry, that was the investigation. That's the congressional investigation, if you're interested. Investigation of competition in digital markets came out in 2020. So what are the impacts here? Well, there's an impact on innovation, and part of this is kind of indirect, as well as being direct. So they buy out their potential competitors. So companies like Meta buy out products like or other companies like Instagram and WhatsApp. But there's also, this has an indirect effect in the sense that it shifts innovators, new startups and so on, to actually start innovating to get bought out rather than to compete, because it becomes too risky to compete against the incumbents. There's also the effect of a dominance on research. So R&D spending of these companies is vast. They have massive influence on fields like artificial intelligence. And you can see some of this here with their huge investments that they're making in digital infrastructures recently. So they invest, and they're investing in these infrastructures that underpin AI, so data centers, things like that. And basically, these investments are made to kind of computing capacities that underpins the supposed AI revolution. And you can see here, this is spending by quarter, and it's currently at about $40 billion per quarter by these these four companies, not even all of big tech. So they're spending 40 billion per. Sorry, how much was that? That's like 160 billion a year on data centers and such like. A fourfold rise in 7 years, basically. Massive spending on land, data centers, computing capacity, in order to control the future of artificial intelligence. So that's big tech. Hopefully illustrated some of the scale, market power of big tech. The next question is, where does it come from? Where does big tech come from? And I think we can trace this back to three kind of major shifts in our societies over the last 15, 20 years. Especially turbocharged after the global financial crisis. One is assetization. One is a zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP, and the other one is a winner takes all logic. If you know my research at all, you'll know that I tend to be a little bit obsessed with assets and assetization as my way of understanding the world. So apologies for doing that again. So assetization, it's a relatively new concept that's become I try to use to understand and describe the transformation of lots of different things into assets. And an asset is a political economic object that can be owned and or controlled, traded, capitalized on the basis of future revenue streams, often where those future revenues are discounted in the present. An increasing proportion of societal wealth and investment has been centered in the transformation of things into assets, or the reconfiguration of them into assets, making more and more things into investable objects and subject to investment kinds of logics. And this is just some of the research that's been going on in the last, pretty recently, this research. And you can see here a quite diverse range of topics and areas and so on. Assetization in computer games, assetization in biomedical research and so on, carbon, data, housing, etc. Assetization has two main societal drivers. One is financial. Specifically, in my view, as I said, the turbocharging after the global financial crisis of the pursuit of a zero interest rate policy through quantitative easing. I'll come back to that in a second. And the other one is technological, basically resulting from the deployment of new kinds of technologies and their impacts, especially in the relation to big tech around network effects of platforms and ecosystems. And I think also in the future that this will be it'll be relevant when thinking about blockchain tokenization and so on. Now, these are two connected issues that follow from the societal trend of assetization. First, Assetization is leading to the emergence of new kinds of markets, especially in intellectual and digital assets. Second, assetization is transforming the way we have to think about the governance of social relations, interactions, resources, and so on. So assetization changes not only the things that are turned into assets, but also how we understand, manage, and govern the political capital relations and transactions. Now, in thinking about the first driver of assetization, zero interest rate policy, this is the policy that was pursued by a lot of countries around the world after the global financial crisis, related to the implementation of quantitative easing. So in short, you can see here, you can see the interest rates this is the US Federal Reserve rate. You can see here the drop to zero. And this is a policy to basically flood the economy with money by allowing central banks to purchase government bonds, other kinds of financial assets that are held by corporations, thereby creating liquidity in the market. And the rationale is that cheap money, you'll be able to flood the economy with cheap money for investment by businesses, create employment and such like. Now the thing is, was this actually what happened? And according to the journalist Christopher Leonard, it's a definite no. So in order to understand what happens, we have to actually understand the scale of this ZIRP regime, which is huge. So according to this journalist, Christopher Leonard, between 2007 and 2017, the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve rose nearly fourfold. So in a 10-year period, rose fourfold as it bought all these government bonds, other financial assets from corporations. As a consequence, it printed nearly 5 times the money that it had printed in the previous 500 years. Right? Huge scale. So quantitative easing in the US alone released $3.5 trillion. Okay? Now, Christopher Leonard goes on to say this was effectively a $310 billion subsidy to corporate borrowers. And this is not for that whole 10-year period. This is for only a 5-year period. But it was also a $360 billion penalty for households as a consequence of zero interest rates. And also a $270 billion penalty for pension insurance funds. So a huge hit on, some parts of the population, a huge bonus for others. This was a global policy, so this only reflects what in relation to the US, so it's more money than this. All that money was driven by an investment logics in which expectations of future yields fell as a safe haven of government debt vanished and investors had to invest in riskier yield at lower returns. So basically, ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, instigated a huge search for investable assets that promised returns to investors. You have this massive rise as a consequence in private capital markets. So money going into venture capital, private equity, and so on. Now, I think that this ZIRP not only changed the economy, I also think it produced a growing reflexivity within investors themselves as this investment logic turbocharged valuation bubbles, which are themselves seen as a viable source of yields. So investors know that something is a bubble. They say this, right? But they invest anyway because everyone else is investing. And if there are no safe alternative left, they have no choice, right? Because they have to make returns for their principles. So we can think of it in the kind of John Maynard Keynes beauty contest analogy. You don't necessarily invest in the best, you invest where everyone else is investing. The objective then becomes to invest and get out before a bubble bursts. And you can see this in terms of what I think of as the sort of bubble blowing across range of pet stocks and assets over the last few years. So we see rising and falling investments flooding into different areas over time. So metaverse, blockchain, NFTs, now generative AI. And suddenly then you have lots of tech companies are treated as valid and very valuable investments that promise high returns. But ZIRP and these tech investments are tied up with the second driver of assetization, namely technological change, and especially this idea of network effects. These have become an especially important driver. So network effects, as I mentioned before, are the benefits experienced by a platform or ecosystem or network user as the number of users rise in that network. So we can think of telephones. The more people that use telephones, the more beneficial it is to get a telephone, right? The same applies to social media, social networks, things like that. Now, network effects underpin a lot of business models with Web 2.0 applications, so the big tech world, if you like. People using these platforms and ecosystems leads to attracting more users, and especially if you give away the product or whatever it is for free to some users. And then you can sell access, if you're the platform, the ecosystem, to those users, to the real customers that you have, who are the advertisers, the developers, the retailers, and such like. This is essentially the Google, Facebook business model. Now, network effects are driven by this, what I've called here, this winner-takes-all logic, in which dominating a market is far more profitable than competing for market share. Opposite. So what you're doing is you're trying to attract, more and more customers, hyperscale as fast as possible, drive out everyone else. And you can see this this kind of winner-takes-all logic in the rise of these venture-backed unicorns, and I've highlighted some of them here. A unicorn is a private company valued at over $1 billion US. There are supposedly, according to CB Insights, there are supposedly over 1,200 unicorns worldwide, valued at over $4 trillion today. These are the biggest unicorns. SpaceX, valued at 350 billion. ByteDance, which is the owner of TikTok, 300 billion, and so on. To put that in perspective, the second biggest company in Canada, a tech company called Shopify's market capitalization is 135 billion. So these dwarf, the kind of Canadian equivalents. There are a bunch of notable past unicorns that have done okay: Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and then there are a number that have failed miserably: Theranos, Quibi, FTX, WeWork. But they're all driven by the need to dominate their markets, or they end up failing. So they often unicorns start as these private companies. They stay longer as private companies, and they stay longer, and they stay unprofitable longer, and they do so in order to drive out their competitors and capture markets. People talk about Uber's VCs subsidizing cheap rides for years in order to dominate the market. And this creates some highly dysfunctional outcomes. And there's a beautiful story about pizza arbitrage that the journalist, I don't think it's a journalist, a blogger called Ranjan Roy tells about his restaurateur friend who realized that DoorDash had put his restaurant on its website without permission. And he realized this because he kept on getting lots of complaints about his pizzas being cold or not arriving or whatever. And he was confused. And then he realized DoorDash had just put his restaurant on its website. Now, Ranjan Roy saw an opportunity to make his friend money, as DoorDash was underpricing the pizzas that it was from this restaurant in order to get people to use the platform. So it was pricing the pizzas from this restaurant at $16, while the actual real price is $24. So Roy worked out that his friend could order his own pizzas through DoorDash, which DoorDash would pay $24 for, but he would pay $16 to DoorDash for. And they experimented, and they worked out that if they just put the dough in the box, then he could net $7 for every order of every pizza that he ordered from himself. So again, you can see venture capitalists essentially subsidizing cheap food for at least a while to drive out competitors out of that area. It's absolutely bonkers business model if you think about it. Wasted money, time, effort, all these sorts of things. So in light of these trends, something I think is missing from our current analyses and understanding of technoscientific innovation. We're missing a clear sense of what is actually driving techno-economic change. Plus, we're missing a clear sense of how our attempt to understand and then pursue techno-economic change are reshaping innovation as a society in unexpected, problematic, and dysfunctional ways. To help address these gaps, or to help understand these gaps, I want to take you back to the start of another revolution, the British agricultural revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. I think that some useful insights can be gained from the historian E.P. Thompson and his discussion of the moral economies of capitalism. So Thompson is talking about the 17th and 18th century and the fact that there were recurrent food riots that were driven by hunger due to rising food prices, especially rising wheat prices. And these riots were seen, he was framing these riots as a defense against threats to traditional rights and customs, and a response to unfairness or injustice, especially around price gouging through wheat prices. From the 18th century onwards, Thompson's argument is that the crowd, as it were, the rioters, actively challenged a new set of capitalist dynamics, in which wheat production, dynamics and wheat projection. Well, what were these dynamics? So wheat producers were adapting to a new political economy of capitalism that was changing the market and market customs on which the majority of people relied for their food. So wheat sellers initially followed seasonal patterns. Small producers were forced to sell their wheat first at lower prices, while larger producers could hold back wheat and sell at higher prices after the small ones are sold. But as both small, medium, large producers became more attuned to the capitalist shifts, especially with the fact that you could generate more revenues by withholding your wheat, you'd notice, reflexively you think, if I withhold my wheat, I get a high price. There was a shift in which expectations of yield replaced actual yield in determining prices. So wheat producers could raise prices by fostering expectations of shortage and then reap the revenues they generated, holding back wheat prices. Now, in my view, these wheat producers this is evidence of these wheat producers becoming increasingly reflexive and aware of how their actions shape the world around them, and took advantage of that to generate higher revenues for themselves at the cost of rising hunger. We see a similar dynamic at play in technoscientific innovation. The Silicon Valley investor, William Janeway, I'm not sure if I do this a lot. I forget, but I should have jumped forward a slide. The Silicon Valley investor, William Janeway, wrote a book called Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. His basic point is pretty similar to Thompson's about wheat producers. Janeway's argument was that financial bubbles are actually the way that technoscientific innovation gets financed. Now, the problem is, what if the bubble becomes the ends rather than the means of technoscientific innovation? So as investors and innovators become more reflexive, just like the wheat producers, they can see that it's the expectations and promises of innovation that generates the greatest returns for them, rather than the actual innovation outputs themselves. And this is where assets come back into the picture for me, because they're manifestations of these expectations and promises of innovation, because they're valued in the present on the basis of future expected returns. Moreover, investors and innovators, having become reflexively aware of how innovation supposedly happens and how new techno-economic paradigms or revolutions or whatever supposedly emerge, is they deliberately start to pump prime tech bubbles with the idea of riding that wave of speculation of that new technology that can be presented as the next big thing. Unfortunately, the result is we don't get technoscientific innovation that drives societal benefits anymore through productivity gains. Instead, we get a series of bubbles that generate enormous returns for a select few tech oligarchs in this case. I think that's where we are at today. And I'm calling this the kind of scam stage of capitalism, where we've worked out reflexively, market actors have worked out how to scam, how to game the economy. And the problem is that results in a set of problematic innovation strategies, which I call parasitic and monopolistic innovation strategies. I'll start with the parasitic one. So it refers to the technologies that are designed to limit access to resources or to undermine regulations, social conventions, to undermine competition, to avoid competition, to fool or scam customers, to exploit user psychology, to lock us into using a product, to stop customers doing their own repairs, to use information asymmetries to exploit markets, and so on. This is my example of this, which is a fairly recent example, a recent instance of a company using copyrighted material to train AI models without compensating the copyright holders. If you've not seen it, this is Meta. There's a court case against Meta for using this library of pirated materials called LibGen to train their Llama 3 model. This is an article in the Atlantic, very recent one, I think, by commentator Alex Reisner, who says that argues that Meta's deliberately used this libgen database to train these models, citing evidence from the court case in which employees discuss the issues of using libgen. And I think there's some you can see some evidence of reflexivity in these discussions. One employee is quoted as saying, if we license one single book, we license one book, we pay for it, we won't be able to lean into a fair use strategy, right? So they can't license any of these books, they just have to keep using the unlicensed ones. They also discussed, according to Alex Reisner, how to mask their activities. And according to Reisner again, apparently Zuckerberg gave permission after the kind of approach escalated up the chain. You can look up your own articles here in libgen, in this libgen database, to see what Meta has used to train their AI model. I did it. I got 71 results, so yay for me. But it takes you back to that kind of Napster era when, and think about how was Napster treated when it did things like this, right? Napster went bankrupt in 2002, by the way, in case you're interested. This on the left here is this is a Taylor. I think this is from Taylor and Francis. This is about rights income from electronic data licensing. So Taylor and Francis basically sent out to Waters, just told Waters, "Oh, we're selling your, material for training data." I think we get some income from that. But, yeah. The next example is around monopolistic innovation models. I use the example of Google search and ad tech here. So Google recently, I think end of last year, lost a case that the US Department of Justice brought a monopolization case that they brought around their search product. And so this is the impact of this on Google is currently being debated, and it will be decided towards the end of the year. So whether they have to split up their products and sell them on things. There is an ongoing case around monopolization in the ad tech sector still being pursued by the Department of Justice. Now, monopoly is often associated with forms of rentiership, so the construction of economic rents, which can be defined as excessive payments to asset owners. And my argument is that this kind of monopolistic innovation model is around innovators seeking ways to extend their ownership and control rights over a growing range and variety of assets. Now we can see this, I think, in the kind of Google case, or at least other people have argued in the Google case that we can see monopolistic practices here. Because this is if you've never seen ad tech before, this is the ad tech sector represented just by Google's products, right? So Google's products cut across every single intermediary in the ad tech sector. They come in from the advertising side and the publishing side, and they all come together in the middle in this ad exchange in the middle. So they operate across both sides of the market. They operate in every area of the market, and everyone feeds into this beautiful system. This is their system before 2008. This is their system after 2008. If you're really interested in Google's ad tech, read my book, Data Inputs. The basic kind of issue is that with this kind of ad tech model, it's designed to control as much of this ad tech system as possible. And there's a series of allegations and claims about Google's ad tech ecosystem that you can read in court cases that have been brought. So there's the Department of Justice one I mentioned. There's one brought by the Texas Attorney General, I think, as well. And there are claims around the arguments about Google introducing new kinds of technologies into their ecosystem in order to undermine competition. There are allegations around the design of auctions that limit access to data for the users or the advertisers and publishers, so that they both become reliant on Google for data analytics. There are allegations about the manipulation of auction pricing, allegations around the payments to manufacturers to install Google Search and other products, well, Google Search in this case, to capture traffic for their ad tech systems. So one of the court case on search is an allegation, well, in the case, a claim that Google was paying Apple $18 billion a year to set Google search as its default search engine. Okay. The basic point then is the basic point of all of this is that we're in an era in which innovators as well as some of their investors, social advocates, understand the societal epistemic power of innovation in ways that lead them to strategically, reflexively create and or reinforce their technological and market power, especially through entrenching monopoly dynamics and market concentration. So really, our role in STS, Science Technology Studies, Science Technology Society, is thinking carefully about, what organizations like PigTech are doing and its implications in order we can identify, the problems that we see increasingly in our societies and economies that results from this kind of unhealthy innovation models underpinning what I think of this scam stage of capitalism. These problems are currently defined by the dominance of US-based digital tech firms driving digital and AI innovation, and they relate specifically to the growing dominance of innovation models and strategies in which the pursuit of extractive, parasitic, or monopolistic objectives is fast becoming the raison d'etre of technoscientific R&D, or to the detriment and exclusion of innovation models. So, I'm going to finish by examining the rise of tech oligarchy, specifically in the US, in relation to these, the previous arguments. So, we've already seen, kind of people have been discussing tech oligarchy for a while, but perhaps the starkest warning came from President Biden in his farewell address in January 2025, 2 months ago, who, reflecting on, like Eisenhower before him, reflecting on the state of America, highlighted some of the dysfunctionalities of the US state, economy, society, and so on. And he said, "Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. I'm equally concerned with the potential risk of a tech industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well." So, kind of hearkening back to Eisenhower's discussion of the military industrial complex, but also raising this issue around oligarchy. Now, this manifestation of the tech oligarchy, we can see this as a social phenomenon, evident in things like the Trump inauguration, and since then, they manifest much more clearly with the activities of the Doge run by Elon Musk. So this is just a picture from the inauguration. These CEOs donated, large sums of money to the Trump inauguration fund, stood at the front of the audience, and subsequently began to dismantle policies deemed contrary to Trump's positions, like DEI policies or working with the military policies and such like. So what I've been talking about, the parasitic, monopolistic innovation models, have not only resulted in the concentration of personal wealth in our societies, which goes on long before tech, it's also led to a concentration of societal resource allocations and collective legitimation in the hands of fewer and fewer people whose view of the world is so narrowly defined that they can't help but redefine every solution in kind of techno-solutionist terms, and can't actually help but redefine society itself as a series of problems to be solved by technology. And these are the people we can define as a tech oligarchy. But the question then is, how does their personal wealth translate into societal and collective influence? So let's consider what the tech oligarchy might, as a term, might mean. So oligarchy question, especially in the US, is not a new debate. Pops up repeatedly in the US context. In the early 20th century, we can see the American sociologist Robert Michels positing a kind of Weberian, iron law of oligarchy, reflecting the notion that organizational necessity leads to the establishment of elites who come to run state bureaucratic entities. So essentially, bureaucratic organizations tend towards increasingly centralized control. More recently, the American political scientist Jeffrey Winters has written about the rise of oligarchy in the US, centered on the kind of extreme wealth and a politics of wealth defense, especially in the early 2000s. So for Winters, the oligarchy was reflecting the kind of rising inequality that is increasingly defined by wealth, so assets, asset ownership rather than income. And this was reflected in sort of broader concerns around wealth concentration and the policy decisions that get made in relation to it. And we can see this in the work of people like Thomas Piketty, talking about inequality, growing problems of wealth concentration, and so on. Others like Jens Beckert, who's a German sociologist, talking about the expansion of elite that is motivated to lobby for tax exemptions on assets, inheritance taxes, and recruiting accountants to find ways to avoid tax so that you can pass your wealth down generations. So you have a changing set of regulations and policies to support wealth status. Perhaps the clearest kind of outline of tech oligarchy, though, is work of the legal scholar Julie Cohen from the US as well, who points out that the tech oligarchy is more than the dominance of, say, bureaucratic elites, entails a political coordination to entrench and defend concentrations of oligarchical wealth, like Winters is arguing. But in particular, in relation to informational capitalism, Cohen argues that this form of capitalism depends on coordination and cooperation to construct the central, the kind of the mass scale infrastructures, the assets on which the economy depends, and this coordination and cooperation is led by the private sector, by big tech, and this is where the oligarchs spring from. Through this coordination and cooperation, this private sector has co-opted, reshaped laws, regulations, institutions, and so on. But by doing so, they impose their own technological worldview. So according to Cohen, this represents not only a strategy of wealth defense, it's also wealth offense. So you can see this in terms of the rise of the private markets that I mentioned. You can also see it in changing governance, corporate governance, in the expansion of what's called Class A shares, which give voting powers to the Class A shareholders, which lead to the control of certain by the tight control by CEOs of certain companies like Meta, for example. I also think there's evidence in if we go back to Zurb, we can see evidence in the deployment of state resources to secure wealthy, the assets of these wealthy by undermining the security of the rest of the population. Now, in my terms, or in my kind of what I find personally interesting here, this oligarchy, this tech oligarchy, is deploying their private assets politically to reinforce the concentration of private control over those assets and to extend it to other assets. So their personal wealth is derived from a reward system that favors this techno-economic control over assets and resources, derived from these forms of parasitic and monopolistic innovation. This personal wealth is asset-based, not income-based, constituted by general trends in assetization, so rising asset values that increases wealth and power, and the support of governments that are concerned with ramping up asset values and containing rising incomes. There's a feedback loop in which you have the expansion of asset value underpins these societal trends in assetization, translate into even further rise in wealth. So this kind of really get caught in. Now, this oligarchy can be conceptualized as specifically a tech oligarchy because it entails a political coordination amongst this section of capitalists in support of their interests, centering on the high-tech sector, digital, artificial intelligence, and so on, their modes of investment, this kind of venture capital, winner-takes-all logic, and a specific kind of form of monetary governance. These three come together as the epistemic and ethical fount of beneficent innovation and thus societal growth and productivity. This is the way they're framing it. So such political coordination not only positions monopolistic and parasitic technoscientific innovation as the main, if not only, source of societal progress and productivity growth, but also entrenches this kind of innovation as only possible within an ecosystem controlled by a few multinational corporations. It's centered on a Silicon Valley exceptionalism, which is similar to American exceptionalism. I apologize to Americans in the audience. By which I mean Americans and Silicon Valley tech pros think of themselves as exceptional and therefore the legitimate fount of epistemic and ethical values for everyone else in the world. So that's why you get Vance, J.D. Vance, telling all the Europeans at the Munich Security Conference what they should be doing. Okay, so conclusions. What makes tech oligarchy particularly problematic? Don't think it's necessarily just a question of wealth, concentration, and political power. There's a combination of these two things with the, I don't know what to say here. I can be rude. I can say the uselessness of these oligarchs themselves to understand the world beyond their very narrow and self-serving perspective. I don't know if there's a less rude term to say here. Examples I can think of are Elon Musk whining about people being mean to him, and about what he's doing with Doge and the destructiveness of Doge. Or Mark Andreessen's techno-optimist manifesto spends a lot of time, banging on about the benefits of free markets, which all leads him to shift his support from Biden to Trump, because Trump's promising lower taxes pre-election. All that carelessness of the Metas hierarchy presented by Sarah Wynne Williams in a biography of Careless People, or the kind of actions of Adam Newman that I mentioned at the beginning in his kind of discussions that flow. So to summarize, and I'll come back to these issues here in a second. To summarize, the tech oligarchy is emerging in the contours of a specifically technoscientific capitalism in which asset-rich market actors have assumed an increasingly prominent political role. It's a political role that entails the use of their personal wealth to defend asset control and extend it further over new assets. It's thoroughly entangled with capitalist dynamics, capitalist dynamics of big tech's monopolies and oligopolies, entails reflexive strategies in the pursuit of this parasitic and monopolistic innovation. Noticeably, it's very US-centric, but it also plays out globally. Who controls the digital infrastructure, and who can brick our airplanes, right? This is something that is incredibly important. There is a global geography to this power, and an elite few Americans have an inordinate say in how much or how to technoscientifically organize all of our societies, polities, and economies. So going back to the starting point, why does this matter? We have to pay more attention. I think this is where science technology studies comes in, or science technology society comes in. We have to pay more attention to where we're heading and who controls the direction of where we're heading, and have challenged the unseriousness of the tech oligarchy. So to be parochial in STS, we have to do more on these fronts here. Unpack the reflexive performativity endemic in contemporary capitalism. And this, is evident in debates around promises, expectations, and so on that social actors deploy and enroll others in their projects. We need to engage in policy to challenge the kind of political surrender to a mythic economy. We need to help policymakers reframe how they treat economic entities, especially big tech, and understand their influence over political policy action. More holistic political thinking is needed. Need to do more to shape the development and deployment of science and technology so it's not primarily motivated by the collection and accumulation of private assets. And finally, we need to rethink this ascendancy of money as the arbiter of quality and legitimacy that has meant that today certain social actors, tech oligarchy, are lauded as the fount of collective technoscientific wisdom and insight, representing kind of key opinion leaders for societal transformation on the basis of their financial power, which is used to legitimate their insights. And this needs unraveling and challenging. So thank you very much. I have a few people to thank before anything else. So thanks to Jamie, colleagues in the Department of ST&S, Connected Minds, Institute for Science and Technology, Institute for Technoscience Society, all wonderful research collaborators I've worked with, all the referees, editors, everyone else who's helped me. And so, and we have, 3 funding acknowledgements as well, for Richard A. Jarrell Fund, Shirk, and the Connected Minds CF ARIA. Thank you very much.